Welcome to a special episode of the Good Word Podcast here on Yahoo Sports. If you see me on YouTube, you can see that I am on the floor of the Ball Arena in Denver following Game 2 of the NBA Finals. It is a series. The Miami Heat, with their stubborn asses, decided to make a series of it, coming back from down 15, 111, 108. I am joined by our buddy, my man, Jake Fischer. Jake, normally you're on the other side of this. So as I set this up to you, all you got to do is knock down shots like, Gabe Vincent, like Duncan Robinson, not like Michael Porter Jr. Did you notice that? Did you notice who wasn't making shots tonight for the Denver Nuggets? But just all in all, from where you sit, how did you view tonight's game? Was this a story of Heat resilience, or was this a story of the Denver Nuggets getting a little too cute?
So we'll start with Michael Porter Jr. because you left that out there, and I will take that specific pass and run with it. He's someone that I'm always kind of paying attention to because I feel like maybe this is just my experience, but as a reporter, when you talk to people like at different stages of their career, like I had to sit down with him in his hotel room in Vegas during the summer league after his like redshirt year. And like, you kind of just fall into these little biases of rooting for guys who maybe just you had an interesting experience with them. And like, he's kind of this maligned figure for being a bit of like a knucklehead with shot selection and attention to detail on defense. And like, he was at the crux of all of this conversation in Denver about, Mike Malone just like used to refuse to play the kid because of that lack of attention to detail. And now it was kind of a storybook turn of events to me, from my perspective, of Malone using a lot of his press availability, which clearly he values as like a tactical time to send out specific messaging to the public, but also to his locker room. He's given a lot of praise to Michael Porter Jr. about all those bugaboos that used to be the thing that was the thorn in Malone's side. So in a game where like they were just desperate for someone outside of Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic to perform, for him to really put up such a goose egg by like reverting back to all those poor old tendencies that have been like a calling card of his and was like the mountain he needed to climb in his development had to be super tough to watch for Nuggets fans and for Denver coaches. As far as like the overall impact of the game and what the story was, I mean, to me, this was Miami doing what Miami's done all playoffs long. Like the fact that there was something left to be grabbed out in the middle of the ring and the Nuggets were leaving it for their opponent to go take it from them. Like Miami has done that time and again, every single game. Why not? Why not time in a game? Why don't we make that expression? So like at a certain point when they go on this massive run in the fourth quarter, like I was writing the Instant Gamer and I was telling our producer John, like before you got in here, you're writing kind of two stories at once and like scrapping apart the one that seemed like it was the obvious outcome as the Heat are just running away with it. And it kind of felt like too good to be true, but it is true. This is what Miami does.
I think that's the biggest thing. And for those who are going to hear this in the morning, Nikola Jokic was spectacular, right?
Oh, yeah.
Took 28 shots, 41 points, only had 4 assists, but I felt like that was kind of by design. Miami, especially when they zoned up late, they wanted to gum up Denver's offense. And that's pretty much what they've done from the middle of that second quarter when the Nuggets went up 15. And if you're in the building, Game 2 was a lot louder than Game 1.
It felt it on TV too.
I was going to say, I didn't know how it came across on TV, but I felt it. We felt it on press row when we were like, man, this sounds a lot louder. So you're thinking when they're hitting 4 or 5 straight threes, you're like, okay, the Kevin Love thing happened and the Pixie magic dust wore off on that. And Miami just looked like a team that couldn't get to the paint. The Nuggets looked too good and it looked like they'd found their rhythm. And those stubborn asses in Miami, they just kept coming. And the one thing, like Denver's, especially when you have MPJ, their ceiling is so much higher, Jake. You know what I mean? They're far more explosive. especially when you have Murray, you have Jokic, and then Porter, who honestly I thought for this team to be really, really good, back a couple of years ago, I was like, MPJ is going to have to be the second best player on this team. And then Murray's going to be the third guy, the point guard, so to speak. And it hasn't necessarily happened because Porter has played his position. You know, he rebounded really well in the conference finals. He defended really well, played well in game one. He shot 2 of 10 from 3, but he played well. And a lot of the comments after the game, the Nuggets were really dejected. Like Dan Devine's going to have a piece talking about the Nuggets collapse. But it felt like they expected to win this game in a way that could linger on for them afterwards, because they'd always taken 2-0 leads in the first 3 series. They'd always protected home court. They hadn't lost the game here, I think, since March 30th.
That's correct.
So you have all those things working against you now, Jake, because this Miami team just refused to quit. And Eric Spoelstra is a friggin' wizard. He's the best coach in basketball, right?
Yes.
He and Ty Lue. They can take theirs and beat yours, and they can take yours and beat theirs. Like, that's how good Spo is. So now as we spin this to Miami, you still haven't gotten the breakout Jimmy Butler game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bam Adebayo played extraordinarily well. Like, I don't think, Jake, people understand how hard it is to eat a player giving you 40. And to stay out of foul trouble, to not hack them, to stay with it mentally, and then to go and give it to him on the other end, and to play with aggression, and for him to take advantage in that fourth quarter. They ran that 3-man action on the left side of the floor to perfection, whether it was Duncan Robinson or Gabe Vincent, who came up big again, or Jimmy Butler when he came in after the 8-minute mark. They played perfect basketball on the road in a hostile environment. Jake, are you surprised? That's all good. I feel like we should not be surprised anymore. Yeah. But Denver's really good. You know what I mean? Denver's really not good. Boston. They're not Milwaukee. They're really freaking good. And Miami came in here and took the game from them.
They did. I mean, so not to keep harping on MPJ, but I think that going into this, when Kevin Love, I believe it was Jared Greenberg at NBA TV who first had the scoop that Love was coming off the bench. This is the first time he's played since Game 5 against Boston. He didn't play in Game 6. He didn't play in Game 7. He didn't play in Game 1. And just thinking about it conceptually, and I know that these adjustments kind of get overvalued in a lot of our post-game interactions and recaps and whatever, but it did change the kind of geometry of this game. And thinking about it conceptually before we saw it, you know, obviously Kevin Love has to guard one of Aaron Gordon, Nikola Jokic, or Michael Porter Jr. He's not guarding Jokic. That's just not where he's at this point of his career. He's probably not guarding the guard either. He's probably guarding the connective, playmaking four. That was what I thought. So to me, Michael Porter Jr. would have had the mismatch in theory on offense, but he ended up being the mismatch on defense because all those actions you're talking about with Gabe Vincent and Duncan Robinson doing those little pin downs in the corner where Duncan can either just flare off that and Gabe pops out, or Duncan can keep going up the arc and flare around Bam's dribble handoff. Like, that's the kind of stuff that 3-minute action you're talking about is where it was so glaring that MPJ got caught in all those screen actions, and he would follow Duncan into the paint and leave Gabe open. He would overplay Gabe.
It's a complex thing. It's not easy. Like, we're cracking on him. People are cracking on him, but that's not an easy action to contain because they don't run it the same way every time.
Yeah. And I mean, I am not a doctor. I haven't asked him about it, but reading the details that Miran Fader had at the Ringer about this brace he needs to wear on his ankle in order to even have feeling in his foot, he's at a disadvantage guarding those little jitterbugs around the perimeter. That stuff has been a baked in bread and butter of Eric Spoelstra's offense in Miami pretty much ever since LeBron went back to Cleveland, dating back to when your guy Wayne Ellington was, hurdling off screens and running around, and he was leading the league in 3-point shooting. So Miami's been doing this for, almost a decade now. LeBron went back to Miami in 2014. So the stuff has been working for a long, long time in a league where everyone knows exactly what you're doing. So you're right. It's not easy. It's not exactly something that, we should expect him to be able to clamp down on, but it is it's the new geometry of the matchup from kind of to take that expression I was hitting on earlier. So yeah, I mean, they also like didn't get a good game from Caleb Martin in this one, who got
He was a game time decision because of it, because of illness coming into it.
Yeah, and demoted from the starting lineup. I think maybe even in part, I mean, Spo said after the game that this was their starting lineup with Kevin Love for a while. They were 10-4 with it. Now they're 11-4 with it. They just went into the finals with Caleb because that was what was working for them. But we go back to Miami now, where in theory, the old adage goes, supporting cast shooters like Caleb Martin shoot better at home. He also should have 3 full days, basically, in terms of game time to be able to heal from whatever this illness is that's plaguing him. And Jimmy Butler, to your point, I mean, he hit one of those weird like line drive threes that he always manages to hit in the fourth quarter and a couple of mid-range buckets. Like, he still does Jimmy Butler things and ends up with 21 points, but like, we have not seen him actually be like a demonstrative Jimmy Butler guy yet in this series. So do we get that Miami, and all of a sudden this team that has been the underdog in every single freaking series, all playoffs, that gets counted out every time? We were all counting them out. We were all saying, like, it was the opposite. Denver was this underdog and we never gave them attention. Now coming into this series, it was a Nuggets love fest. And you even see it now, not to take a shot at the worldwide leader, but it was just interesting to me. It's been interesting to me how much they've been obviously touting Jokic as like the world's best. And clearly there's been some type of concerted effort to kind of market him as one of the game's greatest, as we're, inching ever closer to a post LeBron, Steph Curry world, where the ESPN broadcast coming back from commercial after the buzzer, they're showing that tic-tac-toe play of Jamal to Jokic, that one-hand feed to Gordon coming on the baseline, when Denver kind of did have a big collapse here. So Miami doing this without any of the spotlight on them, now they go back home and they have home court advantage. Like, no, I'm not surprised. It's just, we all should have seen it coming.
This is a narrative busting series. You know what this is, Jake? This is the narrative busting series. Miami hates to be the favorite. Denver has this very passive aggressive approach.
Yeah.
Like, nobody
maybe it's just Michael Malone. Maybe it's just Michael Malone.
No, it's not. It's an organization. It's an organizational thing by and large. It starts from Michael Malone.
Yeah.
Calvin Booth isn't really like that, but it starts from Michael Malone and sort of goes into the locker room. It's like nobody pays us any attention, but if you ask them to try to get to know them, they don't want you to get to know them. You know what I mean?
You're right.
It's very KGB Spurs-esque, and now in this new media world where, we really dig into the cracks of things, we get to see it. We get to see it. And now they get to face some scrutiny. This is the first time in these playoffs where they will face some level of scrutiny or adversity. Miami, we know, had to deal with adversity. It was self-inflicted adversity, but it was adversity. When you lose 3 games in a row to the Boston Celtics, when you lose in the devastating fashion that you did in Game 6, and then you come back in Game 7 and just kick their ass. We should have known. We should have known that Miami was going to come back with an appropriate response, and they did. Jimmy Butler, like we said, has not had a Jimmy Butler game, but he had 8 points in the fourth quarter, and almost like in a fitting way, in the first possession, he gets the ball in the fourth quarter, he dribbles it off his foot, leads to a Denver bucket. Next time down, contested 3 in the face of Aaron Gordon. And then he gets another bucket. And you're like, okay, Miami's starting to stabilize themselves. And let's just talk about the shooting. Because like you said the shooting tends to carry at home. This is another game where the Heat shooters, Game 7 in Boston, they shot well in Game 6 against Boston. They just didn't win the game. They just didn't finish it off. But they've shot well in 3 of the last 4 games, and now you go home. Gabe Vincent, 4 of 6 from 3, 23 points. Max Strus, after going full John Starks in Game 1, comes back and hits 3 threes in the first quarter, 4 of 10. Duncan Robinson, the huge fourth quarter. Jake, have they found something offensively? Have they found a glitch in the Denver matrix where Denver looked like the team early in the season that was around 20th in defensive efficiency? The effort wasn't always there. Did they find something, or was this just a one-game blip?
So I think back to the New York series where I saw them play Game 1 and Game 5 at MSG, and then I was following the rest of it pretty closely on TV. And, New York it's funny. Tom Thibodeau will push back at the idea that the Knicks led the league in isolation offense, but statistically, they were one of, if not the, heaviest ISO teams all regular season long. It happened in the playoffs too, with Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle pounding the ball. And I say that to say, in contrast to what Miami was doing with the, they just have these ping pong passes zipping around the perimeter, where these guys all know how to head fake and sidestep and head fake again and swing it back and reverse it. And, they just do these flybys in the corner like it's, second nature to them, where I think they might have gotten a little bit more like handoff and like reserved in those Boston series, where think back to like that high school 3-man weave play where like you just go around and around and around, and it's until someone actually has the like actual balls to go and like go get a bucket. At this level, against Boston and Miami, or at like in Game 6 and Game 7, when the series kind of sludged in the mud a little bit towards the end there, like those possessions are like far more. It's the finals, like the championship's up for grabs, but there's still a long series left to play here. I feel like against Boston, their offense started to feel the weight and the gravity of what those possessions meant. It meant being either the first team to lose a 3-0 series lead or going back to the finals for the second time in 4 years and overcoming that Game 7 loss to this exact team a year ago. I feel like that pressure was kind of slogging down the zippiness of Miami's offense, and Kevin Love being more of a floor spacer than Caleb Martin. Like Caleb Martin's effectiveness getting to the basket was a huge elemental feature of Miami's offense, to the point where he got 4 Eastern Conference Finals votes, not including Ben Rohrbach, who is the sole reason he didn't get it. No, I'm just kidding.
Don't do Ben like that. Don't do Ben like that.
Like, great effort from Caleb for sure, and that like that ability to attack and get those like grimy fourth quarter postseason buckets was so important. But that element of Kevin Love either just head faking and shooting, or swinging the ball and having it just adds a little bit more of a velocity to the pace of that offense that I think picks up again when Kyle Lowry is your first sub off the bench here, which I made note of that, because all playoffs, when Lowry comes off the bench, he is immediately trying to increase the pace of things and do his Kyle Lowry junk it up, take some charge type stuff. With Caleb Martin having an illness and not being the sixth man, because usually that was the first sub with Kevin Love going to the bench and Caleb coming in. Now it was Kyle Lowry. So you had that greater space. You have that more, zip when Kyle comes in. I felt like that rhythm to things carried over throughout the whole game that maybe wasn't there previously.
Well, it's important points you brought up. I'm going to bring up the last point first. You have two good screeners in Kevin Love and Bam Adebayo. You need solid screeners when you need to spring those guys. When you have Jimmy probing and sometimes passing up shots to kick out to shooters, it messes up, it junks up the game defensively, because it throws your rhythm off. And this series got very ugly very quickly. Normally, the first two games, it's a little more free-flowing, right? Your teams are just getting to know each other. I call it the courting phase, right? Where, you're just trying to figure the person out. You're being your best version of yourself, all of that stuff. It's the courting phase. And then you wind up going into a full-blown ugly dance in the mud by Game 4. We're here in Game 2. And if there's one team, Jake, that's equipped to handle playing in the mud, it's the Miami Heat. They feel comfortable there. They dragged the Boston Celtics there. They dragged the New York Knicks there. Everybody thought the Knicks loved playing in the mud until they decided to play against Miami, right?
Here's what, not to interrupt you. Here's exactly what I wrote. I did not tell you this. I don't think you read it. I don't think you had time. You're a busy man. Here's exactly what I wrote in the instant gamer I had to file out to Joe Garza. Both teams overcame double-digit deficits to wrangle horns after intermission. When the pace slowed, like a car's tires trudging through mud, is where this Miami team has thrived all postseason long. That's it. That's been their whole MO this entire time.
Yeah, and Eric Spoelstra said something during his postgame. He said, we've played 56 close games this year, and I'm not sure what metric, if that's determined by...
that means games within the last 5 minutes that
it's like 5 points or less, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So what they lose in talent, or at least in top-line talent, you gain in experience, of what Spo basically termed it as, we had a lot of pain this year. We lost a lot of games that we shouldn't have. And it's not like we know how to lose. I don't think it's one of those things. But I do think they've reached the point, Jake, where they're not going to beat themselves here. You may beat them. You may out-talent them. But they're not going to give you the tools to beat yourself. Like, they missed shots in game one, but Jokic played spectacular. Murray's played spectacular. Like, the Heat didn't necessarily aid them in that way. Tonight, they took the game from Denver in a way that I think is going to hurt Denver, at least their psyche, over the next few days. You know what I mean? Like, Denver has dictated the terms of the series, of every series that they've been in. They've dictated terms, right? They've gotten the 2-0 leads in the first 3 series up until this point. And they sent their opponents back. Remember, Phoenix was, checking themselves, right? The Lakers were definitely going into panic mode after the first 2 games. Miami took Denver's best shot, and they stood tall. And whether that was Eric Spoelstra and the quote-unquote adjustments, now Eric Spoelstra, funny thing, Eric Spoelstra almost snapped at Ramona Shelburne from ESPN. She asked the question that I would have asked had I gotten called on, right? And she said, she pretty much said, hey, it seemed like you guys tried to limit Joker's passing, not quite let him score that type of thing. So
you're saying you have an untrained eye yourself.
Untrained. He was going to, I would not have framed the question that way. I was going to ask him, what does it take when one player is taking the amount of shots that he's taking to stay and not compromise your defense? That's what it was going to be, a question about him staying consistent with the approach. It was not going to be teeing myself up to be called a casual. You know what I mean? There's ways, Jake, that we can comport ourselves in these press conferences that can make you part of the Summer Jam screen. And one thing I know, if ever I'm to ask a stupid question, it will not be in the presence of TV cameras and boom mics. You ask those stupid questions behind closed doors. You ask those stupid questions in text messages to assistant coaches around the league, and you ask them before you go and bring your dumb ass up and ask a stupid question like, you know what I mean? Not Ramona's question, but just saying a question that winds up putting yourself.
Well, yeah. I mean, I got goated by Draymond last year.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You did. I was a few rows behind you there.
I stand by that question, and I'm going to use a very fraught word in today's economy and say that Draymond bullied me, being that he was above me. His microphone was louder than mine, and he did not let me finish.
Jake,
he did not let me. He bullied me. He bullied me on national TV.
We've seen Draymond's movies. Draymond bullying someone looks a lot more, shall we say,
physical?
Tangible. You can feel it.
Yeah.
Draymond's words, not so much.
Yeah.
Draymond's hands. We've seen those movies before. I think you're fine.
It was a bestseller. That one movie was seen and heard around the world. It was awarded. It had ripple effects near and far.
This podcast has completely gone off the rails. I'm sure our producer extraordinaire, John Gennaro, is sitting over there literally rolling his eyes and scratching his head trying to figure out how in the hell are we going to do this after every single NBA Finals game. We'll tell you how we're going to do that after every single Finals game when we come back and talk about some coaching changes around the league, coaching additions and everything else. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Game 2 of the NBA Finals here at Ball Arena in Denver, Colorado. Jake, the coaching carousel continues, right?
It does.
We got some more coaching news. We got Frank Vogel being hired by the Phoenix Suns. That is NBA champion Frank Vogel. To all of you who discount the bubble in 2020, was
put
fired by
respect on Frank Vogel's name, everybody.
Hey, Frank Vogel, a defensive tactician guy, is going to help to try to revitalize or get the best of what's left of Chris Paul, assuming he's there, and Kevin Durant, and maybe repair a little bit of that psyche that seemed to be a little bit fractured toward the end of Monty Williams' tenure there. So not only did they hire Frank Vogel, they made Kevin Young, who was a finalist for the job, the highest paid assistant coach in the league. Jake, I think those situations are very fraught. I think those situations are very tricky to walk into when you're a head coach and it's a new terrain for you and you have an assistant coach that you have to keep now and you have to deal with sort of a guy who knows the terrain already. He knows the front office. He knows the players. He was their offensive guy and he has head coach aspirations. I'm not saying that Frank Vogel should be searching his back, looking for the soft tissue, making sure there's not a knife in it. But I'm saying it makes for a very tricky situation when you're trying to come in and establish yourself with a new group of guys, especially vets like KD and Devin Booker and Chris Paul.
Let me play devil's advocate.
The devil don't need an advocate.
So I spent some time around Phoenix at the tail end of the Monty Williams era and the beginning of the Matt Ishbia era, which the inflection points of those two things meeting, I think, are very important here.
Absolutely.
I mean, one doesn't happen without the other. I'll say that. I think that's pretty straightforward. But I learned a lot. But one thing I definitely learned is that while Monty has been credited for being, this culture setter, this, mentality changer who can come in and add some professionalism and kind of like some family values. And, he's got this, religious backdrop that, it provides a constitution for a locker room, all that. It's not exactly a communication style that blends with everyone, especially young, under 25-year-olds who might not necessarily be hailing from that type of background, right? Okay. And Kevin Young, was explained to me by a couple of folks, was like super instrumental in kind of being not necessarily like a mouthpiece, but like
bridging the gap.
Yeah, bridging the gap between Monty and the people who needed it. Not saying everyone, not saying Monty Williams talked to Kevin Young and then Kevin Young delivered a message to the team. But there are certain things where like certain veterans will tell a coaching staff like, hey, lighten up on this guy. Like, trust me, I got him. That type of stuff. I think maybe this could actually be a benefit of, Kevin Young being someone who Devin Booker definitely backed. I think it might have gotten a little bit overplayed that like Devin Booker was pounding the table for Kevin. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. I don't know. But I do know that he definitely had support of Devin Booker and other Suns players, and he's super, super respected from the area. So it's interesting to your point. Yeah, like a ton of coaching candidates that I've spoken to this cycle who didn't get certain jobs, when they would tell me they were offered the associate job, like in Houston and in Milwaukee and wherever, they were like, come on, man, like, why would I want to, do that? But I think this has the opportunity to be beneficial for everyone involved. It could, turn its ugly head like everything in this NBA world can. But for now, I looked at that as like a win for Kevin Young and a win for the Suns. Honestly, that was my response when I heard and learned the news.
Do you like, let me just back this up because that was Kevin Young.
Yeah.
Do we like the hire of Frank Vogel? It seemed like it came down to Doc Rivers and Frank Vogel. And if that's the case, when you're coming off of Monty Williams, it seems like Frank Vogel is going to be the choice because it seems like Doc Rivers and Monty Williams are far more alike than they are not. And when you consider Chris Paul still being on the roster, it didn't feel like that they were going to be getting that old thing back, as the kids like to say.
And look, while we're just two friends talking into microphones and there's not that many people listening, I will say, Doc Rivers just coached James Harden, who wasn't necessarily a giant fan of him as a head coach. And James Harden and Kevin Durant definitely still talk about things of that nature. So I think that, just something I think was on the periphery of that situation. But yeah, to your point, like Kevin Young would have been a first-time head coach. And I do think that at the end of the day, he was getting a lot of steam, a lot of positive steam, a lot of people in the league who are rooting for Kevin Young. We're feeling good about Kevin Young getting that job. Kevin Young will get an NBA head coaching job one day. Just from being in this world, like I can tell you, he's someone who's just on that path. He's got the respect of the right people. It will happen. But it definitely became clear that Matt Ishbia wanted someone who's done this before, someone with that championship pedigree. I also think the guy he fired getting the richest contract in NBA history probably aided, I guess, the idea of like we need to get someone in here who's like the real deal, who we know is actually the real deal. So I think, yeah, at that point, like when I got wind that it was going to be someone most likely who had done it before, all the signs are pointing towards Frank Vogel. Vogel also was talking to Terry Stotts, I know, for that associate job that ended up going to Kevin Young. I think if Kevin Young didn't get that job, didn't get that reward, let's say, this is just me connecting the dots. I think Stotts would have gotten that job, and I think Kevin Young would have gone to Detroit. I don't know what that would have left with Milwaukee, where James Borrego was involved and what have you. I don't know if it would have been a direct ripple effect like that. But those are the kind of dominoes that happen here, where Kevin Young potentially getting the Phoenix job also was like leaving some Phoenix Suns assistants kind of hanging in the balance, whether they would stay or maybe follow your guy, Monty Williams, to Detroit, where you're based. So I know this is like for the real sickos out there who want to know. I mean, and there's a lot of real sickos. Like I saw a lot of Pelicans fans on Twitter, like pumped about the James Borrego edition. I saw Nets fans pumped about Kevin Ollie. Bucks fans are getting hype about what Terry Stotts can do. Like this is the part of the NBA offseason where the sickos show themselves from the casuals for sure.
Well, the crazy thing is, I hate to tell people this. A lot of times y'all don't know what y'all watching anyway. Okay.
True.
When it comes to coaching, like we all think that we are great at evaluating coaches and saying this guy can't do anything and this guy can or whatever. A lot of times it's a lot more complicated than you think. It's not just who's running floppy and everything else. It literally comes down to managing people, being a consistent, unwavering personality every day while still keeping an open mind to the evolution of an NBA season. And you brought up Monty Williams and him signing the richest contract in the history of the NBA. And I was a little surprised. I thought that, and I'm sure, I don't know, you and Dan, addressed this whole thing, but just, I was a little surprised that I thought he was going to take the year off. But when someone comes and says, in the words of the $1 Million Man, everybody's got a price.
In the words of the $1 Million Man, here's $78 million.
Here's the possibility of $100 million, right? So moving off of that, the one assistant coaching thing that dropped tonight, the Boston Celtics hiring Sam Cassell to join Joe Mazzulla's coaching staff. We've heard that Ime Udoka is going to take a lot of those assistants that he had. There was a lot of loyalty he had from his coaching staff from Boston before he got suspended and then fired. So I'm not surprised that Sam Cassell is there. The question I have to you is, when we going to start talking about Sam Cassell being the new head coach of the Boston Celtics?
Well,
I'm joking, y'all. I'm joking. I'm just playing.
I'm going to say, if it's anything like Philly, and if it's anything like Boston, it'll happen. I mean, but also before I say that, to your point about how people don't know what coaches do, I'm in this group chat. I probably talked about this too many times on podcasts, so if people have heard about my Philly friends group chat, I'm sorry, but it's a bunch of my buddies from high school who tonight during this game, as they have all year, talked about Sam Cassell and wanting Sam Cassell to be the head coach. This crew, they're lamenting the fact that Sam Cassell left. They're like sad he left. And I wrote in the group, you guys don't know what Sam Cassell does. One of them writes, well, he's credited with really relating to Tyrese Maxey. I said, well, Sam Cassell, but if like Philly brings in a 34-year-old guy who's like way closer in age to Tyrese Maxey and like they get along, I'm sure they're going to connect really well too. And like, the one thing I will say with Boston Sam Cassell, played there, won a championship there. And he does definitely, as much as it's like a story, I have heard that like he does relate well with those guards in Philadelphia. I think that will be something of benefit to Boston, being that it seems like they really lost that element with Damon Stoudemire. He was like the former player coach that it's been written about a lot now. Yeah, it's like one of those, people don't talk enough about this, and then to the point where it gets talked about a lot. Maybe it's been talked about a little too much, but losing him mid-season, I think, was a critical element of the Celtics season, being that they lost that strong. I was you. I was once you. I know. I was in your shoes. I know what you're going through. Voice. Steven Silas continues to be a name that gets linked to Boston. I had heard Charles Lee, the Bucks assistant, who's been involved in all these head coaching searches, was also someone that Boston was trying to target here. So they're clearly looking at like veteran, respected dudes. And I mean, Boston's not messing around trying to upgrade the staff and add some veteran talent. So to your point, like, will adding all these people who are seen as viable head coaching candidates be a hot seat backdrop to Joe Mazzulla in a market where you got columnists on the Globe writing that Mazzulla is not meant for this moment when they're down 3-0, and radio show hosts at the Sports Hub and WEI who are just ready to bring out their pitchfork for anyone who is affiliated with a sports organization at any time. Yeah, you're going to set up the opportunity for those to be stories. Will it be warranted? We'll see. But I know you were joking about it and saying it flippantly, but that's just the facts. That's the way it goes. Like, he's in Boston, they're the Celtics, and there are natural successors in place, in theory, that are going to give people at home the opportunity to write a Game of Thrones or Succession style script in their head.
Well, considering I've never seen Game of Thrones or Succession, I can only imagine what the hell that means. I know.
You can't use you use all your earnings on attire and not an HBO subscription.
Okay, wait a minute. Since you brought up my attire, let's take a step back here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's let the people see.
This is for our YouTube listeners. If you're not listening, if you're not watching,
your boy is fly. Okay,
he is fly.
The pocket square, camel jacket, white shirt to tone it down. You get the vibes. All right.
How many pocket squares do you own?
Not as many as you think. Not as many as you think. Kind of buy them as needed. But to your point, yeah, I do think that Brad Stevens almost did Joe Mazzulla a disservice to start the year. And it was a really tricky situation. Let's be perfectly honest. This was caused by Ime Udoka.
Yeah.
And the Celtics, when they made the decision to fire him or suspend him, knowing that they weren't going to bring him back, I felt like if you weren't going to revamp the staff, then Brad Stevens was going to have to come down and coach the team, at least for a year, before going back upstairs.
Is it going to come Pat Riley?
I mean, look, let's be perfectly honest here. This wasn't Will Hardy, right, who would have probably taken this job had he had his druthers. And, you know, you've heard different things through the grapevine about people the Celtics were looking at in that in-between time. But if you knew that a second row assistant was going to take over this team, you didn't really have 6 weeks to put together a training camp plan, a game plan. It was an uncomfortable situation for all.
Yeah.
And this is a championship-ready roster. Are you willing to take the lumps of development in the meantime when you've got Jaylen Brown approaching a supermax, when you've got Jason Tatum about to enter his prime, when you've got Al Horford at the stage of his career that he was at? The Celtics being in the conference finals 5 of the last 7 years, it feels like they're young, but they're so familiar to us. Teams don't stick around and stick together this long. This might have been, in hindsight, their best chance to win an NBA title. And because they were messing around with circumstances, you know, some would say out of their control, Jake. I don't know if I would say all the circumstances were out of their control. You find yourself in a spot like this where you're trying to play catch up. And I feel like when you're trying to play catch up, Brad Stevens probably felt a kinship with Joe Mazzulla, being a young coach, having to take his lumps. But he took his lumps on a team that wasn't going anywhere, on a team that wasn't going to be very good and wasn't built to be very good, and was able to make whatever mistakes he made without being in a high pressure cooker situation like Joe. And I don't think it's a fault of Joe Mazzulla. Like, he's a young coach who was thrust into a situation, and you're not going to say no to an opportunity like that. And now the Celtics, all in all, have to recalibrate themselves because you have to deal with Jaylen Brown, because you have to deal with the roster, because you have to deal with all these other things in addition to a coaching staff.
It's going to be a very different team next year.
It better be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
From at a minimum, a personnel standpoint. And to your point, different means unknown. And the biggest difference and the biggest unknown for this season was really just adding Malcolm Brogdon, aside from all the coaching stuff. So coaching stuff, to your point, I'm not trying to minimize it at all, because obviously we've been talking about it for a couple minutes here. But when you add in now like a true shakeover, and sure, Mazzulla now has a year under his belt. He's got 3 playoff series and 2 Game 7s under his belt. I'm sure he's got different things that he's willing to leave and take forward and that he's learned from, and he'll kind of try to improve. And coming in as someone who's done that before every step of the way, it will probably feel far more familiar and have far greater gravitas in that spot and in that moment. But with a whole new staff, and it doesn't sound like a lot of these guys are people that he's like, when Ime Udoka got hired and all those people who are now leaving to go join him in Houston, like those are all his guys.
All his guys.
Like
yep.
his closest friends from growing up in Portland and guys he's met along the way. So it'll take time for Joe Mazzulla to build a cohesiveness with this entire staff, let alone for a roster that probably will have some type of changeover. I'm not necessarily sitting here predicting a Jaylen Brown trade, but Grant Williams' contract is hanging in the balance. He had early bird extension opportunities in the fall, and there was definitely a gap big enough there between what his representation wanted and how Boston valued him, that I don't know if him not really playing for the playoffs is going to be able to close. Peyton Pritchard, excuse me, is absolutely interested in playing elsewhere. His name was dangling on the trade block at last February's trade deadline, and I've said it here, I've said it on other platforms, like every previous transaction cycle, the trade deadline and the draft and free agency and the trade deadline after that, every 6 months, like the thing that happens before always sets the stage for things that can happen at the next time around. So like you can guarantee I can't say his name right now, Peyton Pritchard is going to be, he wasn't exactly like a piece of this rotation, but you start to crack away at people who have been there, and all of a sudden this team that you're saying has been to the conference finals, 5 out of the last however many years, and has these pieces that have come back together and together and together. Like when you start stripping away all the different particles that make this whole organism at large, it starts to function as a composite very, very differently. So it'll be interesting to see what changes they end up tinkering from the roster too, looking ahead at how the second apron and other new aspects of the CBA are going to change overall, strategy around the NBA, let alone in a contending team with a very pricey tax bill. I think it'll be not that difficult of a situation to get him re-signed in terms of Jaylen Brown. Like, I think it's like buzzy and spicy and sexy to talk about it, but the cap people I trust in the league, like the smart people who every team's GM has to ask before they do anything, they all say it makes no sense to let this guy walk at this age, at this time of his career. So I don't really anticipate that happening. But I mean, Al Horford's going to be a year older. Robert Williams, you just haven't been able to rely on him being there, being healthy in the lineup, as effective as he is. The guard stuff we just talked about. It's going to be a different team. And to your point, like you had a really good shot at it this year, as good as anyone. So to have missed it and to had not necessarily had like the real shot that you want, like Ime Udoka is the coach that, I know Danny Ainge said that he thinks Joe Mazzulla is a better coach than Ime Udoka, but I think everyone involved taking Trucier would have obviously hoped that he was there from the jump and there was no issues at play and they could have marched together in unison and learned and taken care of the quote unfinished business that they had printed on their chest this playoff run from last June against Golden State. They didn't get to do that. And yeah, to wrap up my rambling here, to your past point, Vinny, like they're not going to be able to do it again because it's going to be a much different cast of characters from the bench to the roster, and we'll see how it all shakes out.
That is Jake Fischer. Jake, before we go, because you just said a mouthful, and I just want to like let the mic drop on that. But before we go, Game 3 in Miami will be Wednesday. I don't know why the NBA decided to give the extra days in Denver, because it ain't that fun. Game 3 is Wednesday, Game 4 is Friday. If you're going to give us extra days NBA, give it to us in South Beach, okay?
Give us one. Can you give us one quick Denver day off Vinny Goodwill story, or no? Is that out of bounds?
It's not out of bounds. I will say this. I had dinner one night with... Which dinner night? Okay, I'll say this. I had dinner one night with Charles Barkley and Michael Wilbon and a group of people.
There you go.
And Charles Barkley literally addresses me as a motherfucker. He might not even know my name, but he might, right? Like, but we've hung out around each other, and he'll say, "Where you been? Why haven't you been around?" He was asking me basically why I wasn't at the Eastern Conference Finals, which TNT did.
Yeah.
And I was like, I was covering the West. So we just we went to various spots and just had a great time. And Chuck was just regaling us with stories that I can't repeat and everything else. And it was just a really, really fun time that we can talk about another time, John. Now, before Game 3, like, how do you see Game 3 playing out? What are you going to focus on Game 3 in Miami with this series tied? Do you think Denver comes in with a little more resolve, or do you think that this dings their mental approach, considering they've lost home court advantage?
I think they'll be fine in terms of mental fortitude. I mean, this is a team that like kind of didn't give a shit about the last 15 games of the regular season, to the point where it scared me away from believing in them in the playoffs. And I think every single one of our staff members at Yahoo picked Phoenix over Denver in the second round. And they kind of just woke up when the time was now, and they did it, and they marched their way to the finals. So they got punched in the mouth here. I think even if they lost a couple teeth, I think they're going to swing back. I do. This is a team that's got real championship spirit. Michael Porter Jr., we've talked about probably too much, to your point about him getting maybe a little over-goated, but he's going to be top of mind for me, just because it was so glaring. For as good as Jokic was, and as like, oh my God, this guy is just a mammoth in the paint, and there's nothing the sea of Heat defenders could do against him. It was just as glaring to me that Michael Porter Jr. was a no-show after how well he's played in the playoffs so far. So I'll be looking at him again.
I think this is going to be a very interesting series, and I think it's just beginning, and I think it's going to be a lot more fun than people think. That is Jake Fischer. He is Jake L. Fischer on Twitter. I'm Vince Goodwill, your host of the Good Word with Goodwill. Thank you all for joining us. I know it's not our regular podcast schedule, but we appreciate you guys coming on with us. We're going to be coming on after every NBA Finals game. Don't forget, Jake and Dan will be back for No Cap Room after Game 3 on Wednesday. On the Clock with Kristen Peak will be back on Tuesday with an episode about the Thompson twins from Overtime Elite headed into the NBA draft, which I am not ready for at all. John Gennaro behind the glass, Evan and Ron putting together the videos. We thank all of y'all. And until next time, everybody be safe.